I haven't dreaded Mondays since I started working for myself, which is not something a lot of corporate people can say. I feel like it's a fun job.
Are you ready? All right. Welcome to the Remote Work and Travel Show. I'm your host, Nora Dunn, aka the Professional Hobo, and in this interview series, I speak with ordinary people who have extraordinary travel lifestyles and remote careers to get the real dirt on what it's like to travel long-term and work abroad. This is my first in-person interview. I'm really excited to experiment with this new format, and today I'm speaking with Tim Leffel. Tim Leffel is an author, travel writer, and publisher with more than 25 years of experience. He has won dozens of best travel writing awards over the course of his career and is frequently invited to speak at writers' conferences and travel industry events. He began as a travel freelancer while circling the globe 3 times over several years of travel and has written for Outside, Lonely Planet, USA Today, Global Traveler, and a multitude of newspapers and airline magazines. He's the author of 5 books, some of them in multiple editions, including The World's Cheapest Destinations and the best-selling Moving Abroad title, A Better Life for Half the Price, which we will be talking about today. As the head of Al Centro Media publishing company, he oversees 5 online magazines and blogs. His Cheapest Destination blog is one of the longest-running travel blogs on the web, established in 2003. His Perceptive travel site features narrative stories from published book authors and has been active since 2006, winning awards each year and getting stories into several book anthologies. Tim grew up in Virginia and has lived in 5 U.S. states and 3 foreign countries. And when he's not traveling, he's now based in Guanajuato in Mexico, in the Highlands, where we are sitting right now in Tim's house. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you. In person, in the house that all that built.
It is amazing, and we're going to talk about all of this and more. In fact, actually, let's start with Mexico. We met back in 2014 when you were passing through the Sacred Valley of Peru, and I was living there at the time. And you interviewed me for the first edition of your book, A Better Life for Half the Price, which is ultimately for people who want to move abroad and live, make their money go further, ultimately. And you obviously walk the talk. I mean, you've had this house here in Guanajuato, Mexico for 10 years, I think?
Yeah, roughly.
What was the process for you to decide that you wanted to move abroad and then to choose Mexico and Guanajuato as a location?
Well, I traveled a lot around the world, and I think most of us who are frequent travelers tend to be thinking in the back of our mind, wondering, could I live in this place? When you visit a new destination, a lot of times it's obviously no, but sometimes the place kind of speaks to you in one way or another and ticks off some boxes. And we lived in Korea for more than a year, South Korea, and we lived in Istanbul, Turkey, and both of those were teaching English. So we had that experience of living abroad and really liked that, being a part of the culture instead of just passing through and really learning how the place ticks and meeting people and spending time with them. So we wanted to do that eventually with our daughter, and we waited until she was about 10 years old before we finally made the move. And we looked at a few different places, different countries, mostly in Latin America, to kind of stay in the same time zone, roughly. But we ended up in Mexico partly because we love it here. We like the food and the culture and everything, but also it's convenient, it's close, airfare is not expensive. So all those things kind of check the box for us to be able to get back and see family and friends and do business, go to conferences, all those things.
So you moved here then with your daughter when she was about 10 years old. How was that process? I think there's a lot of people who I think are afraid of making such a move as a family. How was the process of raising her through her adolescence in another country?
It wasn't that difficult from, the adjustment and the education and things like that. The worst part was just emotionally dragging her away from the place she had known her whole life and her friends and everything. We knew she'd get over it, but it didn't make it any easier. We basically told her, we're selling this house, we're moving away, and we're not coming back here. And that's traumatic for a kid, no matter where you're going. But then we were also moving to a new country on top of it. But she did okay. We put her in language classes for a while, and then once she started school, she was speaking in Spanish all the time, so she got up to speed really quick. She had a friend in the neighborhood that she hung out with, and so she learned, colloquial, real Spanish. And yeah, so she adjusted pretty well. There were a few other foreigner kids in town too that she could hang out and speak English with. But yeah, and then we went back and forth a few times after that, and she always made the adjustment quite easily. Um, we can talk about this more later, but it's just when she got older, the higher up you get in the education system in some countries, if you're not in a big city, then you start to see more deficiencies and it starts mattering more. But I think she was here for a year of elementary school and 2 years of middle school, and I don't think it really had any negative effect. And on the plus side, she learned another language, which is worth a lot.
I can imagine. I know she's now a young adult and she is living back in the States, but I can only imagine that her years of living abroad have informed really a large portion of who she is. How does she refer to her time in Mexico?
It's hard for an American kid, who's used to having everything at their fingertips and the convenience and 300 TV channels and all of that to leave it behind. And so I think she would prefer to be there, at least at this point in her life. But I think she does look fondly on it now. And I think it made her more worldly wise, which was part of our intention, to show her that consumerism and, always on convenience in the U.S. is not necessarily the norm everywhere else. And I think it made her a better adjusted person and a wiser person and maybe educated in a different way than you get in school.
Now, this whole lifestyle, this lifestyle has been brought to you by remote work. It is the fact that you have been location independent for all these years, that you had the freedom to be able to flex and make a decision to live abroad. Have there been advantages and or challenges to working remotely while living abroad as an expat?
Far more advantages to disadvantages. I've had a few things where as a travel writer, maybe I couldn't go on a press trip because they didn't want to fly me from Mexico, or maybe some business opportunities were missed because of that. But I think there have been more advantages. As a freelancer, you have more story options. If you live in another place, you have more to draw from, and maybe it's not as competitive. But financially, it's been a massive difference because I'm really glad we rode out the pandemic here, because our expenses were just so low that it didn't really affect us very much when our income went down for a while. Whereas if we had still been in the U.S., it would have been trouble because just, our monthly expenses were so much higher there just for rent and health insurance and utilities and car insurance and everything else. So yeah, it's been an advantage here. And I feel like for international travel, it really hasn't mattered. I can fly out of Mexico City anywhere that I could have flown to from the US if I need to. So I don't think there's a lot of downsides to it. Also, we talked a little bit about the same time zone. I mean, I can make phone calls and it's just like I'm back in the US. I do think it's a little more difficult if people are in a place like Thailand or Bali or somewhere like that, trying to do business with people 12 hours away. That's difficult.
And you're so right, because I actually found when I was in Peru, when I was in South America, but even also right here now in Mexico, I mean, we're still in the pandemic and it ebbs and flows. But one of my decisions to come here was some perverted sense of, I can get back easily. Like if I had to, I could walk back home, and even from South America. And I think part of that is due to the same time zone. And also the same landmass. Like for whatever reason, psychologically, for me, the idea of crossing an ocean and a whole bunch of time zones seems further. I just feel further away.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, you could go overland from Argentina all the way up to Canada without ever getting on a plane. You would have to get on a boat once, but that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it does make it a little easier. From Europe to get to the U.S., you'd have to be on a cargo ship or the Queen Mary or whatever.
Yes, see, it's just so complicated. I like the same landmass. When living in a developing country, when I spent a few years in Peru, I was for a short time dabbling with trying to get my residency. And I experienced bureaucracy in its full flavor. And it was challenging, to say the very least. And I was also considering buying a place, and I felt very insecure about doing it. So you have bought a place, you bought this house, you have been living here, and I believe you and your wife are residents in Mexico now. How has that process been? And do you have any advice for anyone who would be considering moving abroad as an expat and buying property abroad?
Well, there is strength in numbers. There's a million or 2 million foreigners living in Mexico. So it's not like you're the first one doing this. If you tried to do it in some obscure country like, I don't know, Armenia or something, maybe it would be a bit tougher. But here it's pretty straightforward because there's so many foreigners that have gotten residency in Mexico. And of course, there's a long tradition of people going back and forth between the two countries. So it's pretty well established. It was, there's always quirks and bureaucracy, and it takes an extreme amount of patience when you're trying to get residency anywhere in the world that's not your home country. But it's relatively straightforward. You have to apply in the U.S. You have to meet a certain income requirement, so you can't be dead broke and still get residency here. There are countries where you can, but Mexico, there's a higher bar. But once you go through that, then you get the stamp, and then you come to Mexico and you complete the second part of the process, which for us this time, we were in and out in a day, so it wasn't very difficult at all, really. They take your fingerprints, and you have to fill out all the right paperwork and pay some money, but it's not a big deal. Much easier than people going the other way, of course, and trying to get a green card. But some countries are notorious for being more difficult than others, and I think Peru is difficult. Bolivia is even worse, supposedly. But others like Ecuador are dead easy, so it just depends on where you're headed. And the good news is there's this trend now of granting digital nomad visas, so maybe you don't have to stay long term. You would just want to stay for 2 or 3 years. And also, I think some countries are starting to realize that attracting expats is good for their country in a lot of ways, because we tend to spend more money than a local would, but we don't use as many local services. We're not a burden on the system. And, foreigners start businesses that hire people a lot of times. So it's a net gain for them.
You cover a lot of this and a lot more in your book, A Better Life for Half the Price, where you really provide a lot of solid information on a country by country. You choose, how many countries do you profile in the book?
I think there's 19 or 20. There's a few honorable mentions. That kind of makes it less definitive.
One of the things I like about the book is that it really gives people a sense of what is life going to be like there? How easy or difficult is it to get the visas and the paperwork? What are some of the compromises in lifestyle that you're going to have to make? What are some of the advantages that you will experience? I think you just recently released another edition as well. I'm sure Mexico really comes up, roses for you in terms of the ranking of the places. Are there any other, Ecuador being another one that, of course, is very popular with retirees especially. Are there any other destinations that you would like to mention that are worth people considering either moving to as an expat or even just working remotely from as a remote worker?
Yeah, sure. And Mexico's actually gotten cheaper since I first started coming here 20 years ago because the peso is devalued, and that makes the US dollar anyway stronger. Not necessarily the Canadian dollar always, depends on what's going on. But there are certainly cheaper places than Mexico to live around the world. And I would say Ecuador is one of them in South America. And then there are actually places in Europe that are cheaper than Mexico. If you go to the Balkan countries like Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, and then some of the Eastern European ones like Bulgaria, Hungary's pretty close, and Romania. So there are lots of options. And then plenty of places in Southeast Asia are as cheaper than Mexico. The problem is a lot of them have been off limits for 2 years now. So it's harder to talk about those. But yeah, I updated the book because that was my pandemic project. I was able in 2020 to get hold of people really easily. So I interviewed about 60 expats in different countries around the world because I wanted to get the local take. I've been to all of them except Georgia, the country of Georgia. I wanted to get, the inside scoop from people living there. First of all, find out what they were spending, but also what were the pros and cons of living where they were. Because no place is perfect. And, every place has its advantages and disadvantages. And it's good to know those before you commit to living somewhere. Although as a nomad, it's a little easier. You can just leave after 6 months if you don't like it anymore.
Well, and I think one of the things that you mentioned in the book is try before you buy. And you do suggest visiting and making sure that you resonate with the culture, the place, the people. Perhaps, you need to find the specific town or area of town that you want to live in before you jump in with both feet. And I think that remote work now has just made this exponentially more possible. for people, because even if you're working, you can just bring your work with you and check it out for a while and see how it feels.
It has gotten a lot easier because now we take it for granted, but there was no Airbnb 10 years ago. You couldn't just easily pull up something online and rent a place for a week or a month. And it's gotten so much easier. I mean, there were services like VRBO around, but they were mostly vacation rentals at the beach. It wasn't necessarily anywhere in the world. And so it's gotten much easier without speaking the language to just rent a place for a while to try it out. And you'll be in a real neighborhood. You won't be in a tourist zone if you don't want to be. And that's essential. I think you can't go to Cancun and say, this is great, I want to live in Mexico. It's got to be a place where real people live and experience it the way you would if you lived there. And so then you can go out to the butcher shop and go buy fruit and vegetables and maybe, get your pants hemmed and, do whatever you need to do like a local person would do. Go to the hardware store and just figure out how all that works, and just make sure you're going to be comfortable living there, because when you're in a place that's not a hotel and you're spending weeks there, you get a real feel of what it's truly like. And the noises that you might hear.
Yes, we have an orchestra of Mexican sounds in the background. I don't know if these mics are going to pick that up or not, but there's children playing over here and there's renovations going on over there. So that's it. There's dogs barking. Oh, the dogs, yeah. It's always good to have earplugs by the bed. And for some people, that could be a deal breaker. They may not realize, they might not think about that, especially in a residential neighborhood. You might not hear that in a hotel. But then suddenly you find yourself in a residential neighborhood and it's just a whole different scene. And honestly, too, you're talking about, going to get your pants hemmed and going to the hardware store and finding, the fruit lady. And that's one of the things that I actually adored. I mean, it was one of my MOs as a full-time traveler, was I wanted to stay long enough to actually turn a place that on arrival is totally unfamiliar into something that is more familiar. Over the course of a few weeks and months. I'd develop that relationship. I'd find my favorite fruit and vegetable vendor in the market, and I would, know these people that I would pass every day. And developing those relationships, I think, is a big part of why people travel in general, if they travel long-term or as a lifestyle. But then also, if you choose to live abroad, ideally, you're also interested in integrating into that local culture.
And there's been some studies that it's good for your mental health and your brain function too, just to be firing new synapses, new experiences, and new challenges, because a lot of times they're not speaking English and you have to figure that out whatever country you're in. And it's good to keep your mind active by exploring new places and seeing new things and having breaking out of your old routine.
You were so right. And I've actually just experienced that in Technicolor just now, in that, through most of the pandemic, I was working from home like most people. I was locked down in Canada for most of that time. And I thoroughly entrenched myself into a routine of work, and more work. Because as I'm sure as anyone who has had to work from home through the pandemic will know, that when there is no physical separation between your workspace and your home space, it's difficult to create that mental separation as well. So I just found myself, because my office was in the corner of the living room, I would just work more and more, and I didn't have to go out because I was locked down. But I was less and less productive, even though I was working more and more. And it was just this terrible, and eventually my health was at risk because I was working so hard and spinning my wheels. Not only that, but as soon as I got here, I found myself, suddenly it's like, there's all this new stimuli, and I'm speaking in another language because I love speaking Spanish, and I'm looking at all these impossibly colorful houses and streets, and everything is new and wonderful. And and I'm out of my comfort zone. How do I do this? Where do I go for that? But that is stimulating. Like, I feel like some part of me that was dormant has just been reborn by virtue of being able to travel again. And I think that anyone who's watching or listening to this who's enthusiastic about travel can relate to that.
Yeah, and overcoming those different challenges can give you a different sense of accomplishment than your work gives you. Like we talked about the hassles of obtaining a residency visa, but after you've done it, you're like, all right, that was something new I've accomplished.
Big
I made
time.
it to the finish line. It's kind of nice to do something that's disconnected from your day-to-day normality, and or just getting to a point in speaking a language where even you can just order food or take a taxi. That's a sense of accomplishment.
It's a huge success. Yeah, absolutely. Or being able to bargain for something and know that you're actually getting a half decent value,
Yeah.
I mean, for me, just the success of being able to find the grocery store and buy stuff, it's like, all right, that's first one down.
Right.
All right, I want to pivot because I would be terribly amiss not to talk to you about your career, because you have a fairly illustrious career as a travel writer. You are a venerable dude in the business.
Well, it looks better on paper than it does in my bank account sometimes. But yeah, it's going okay.
Well, and that's actually, we're going to get to that in a second. But before I get to that, because I have a question that's actually very much about that. But first, you have 5 websites. It's all I can do to manage one website. How do you juggle all of that? Because a website unto itself is a business. So you've essentially got 5 different businesses. How do you manage all of that?
Well, I think anybody that grows a business over time, they realize they have to automate some things and outsource other things. Otherwise, they're going to be working 24 hours a day, which is not possible, or even just working too much, like you talked about, and it's not good for your health. And I do get 8 hours of sleep almost every night and manage to not work on Saturdays most of the time, a little bit on Sundays, some writing. But I have some help. I've got some really good assistants that help me with certain aspects. I have an associate editor that works on 2 of my sites. I'm not writing everything by any means. I have freelancers and I have regularly scheduled bloggers. And so even though it's 5 websites, I'm not the one cranking out all the content, because that would be a recipe for burnout, I think. And there are people who run that many websites that don't write anything. They just run the business and they outsource the content. Maybe they do their own keyword research or whatever. But yeah, over time, I've just figured out ways to systemize it and automate some things and outsource others. And so my sort of core competency is content creation and just keeping everything going, keeping all the wheels turning, and figuring out how to make the business work. So yeah, I found a decent balance, although I'm looking at selling one of my sites sometime in the next few years, because just to get one thing off my plate and slow down a little bit. I mean, as writers, we don't have to retire in the same way that a bricklayer would, or somebody who does hard labor, so I don't see a point where I will just let it all go and go play golf or something. But I would like to maybe be a little less busy when I get into my 60s and 70s. We'll see. But it's a fun job, It's not like I haven't dreaded Mondays since I started working for myself, which is not something a lot of corporate people can say, I feel like.
And you obviously have the business sense, and you just spewed a whole bunch of different business, like the process of automation and outsourcing, obviously very good business practices. And so you definitely have that business mind. Not all writers do. Some writers just get into it because they like writing, and then they're not so good on the business side, and it can be a challenge. But you started Cheapest Destinations blog in 2003. Now, I started The Professional Hobo in 2006, and there was travel blogs really weren't a thing. I mean,
Right.
Or if they were travel journals. They definitely weren't things that you monetized. And yet, here you were in 2003 with a blog. What was your inspiration to start this? Was it business or pleasure or both?
Yeah, well, I still had a corporate job at that point, which is probably a good thing for most people watching this. Don't take the leap and go become a location independent person before you have any kind of savings or anything to fall back on. So I had a real job, and I was just doing my travel writing on the nights and weekends because I had a young child and needed to make a living. And so I worked an office job, but I wrote this book on nights and weekends called The World's Cheapest Destinations, which is now in its 5th edition. But when I put the first one out, that was the end of 2002. And I had this print-on-demand publisher, but they were still a publisher. And they said, why don't you start a blog? That might help people find you and help sell the book. And I started thinking, it would also help journalists find me if they need a source for a quote, about cheap travel. So I started this blog, and that was really the sole reason, just for publicity. I didn't ever think it would grow into anything beyond that. But then it did start growing. It started making some money. And then eventually I started some other sites and was able to reach a point where I could quit my real job and go full time as a writer and publisher. So, the internet made that possible. I mean, in the old days, as a freelance writer, the only way you made money was writing for magazines or newspapers or whoever you could get to pay you. But, it was a gatekeeper business. And now you can publish on your own and start your own publication, basically. So that was what made it possible.
It's funny, people would ask me over the years when I would say I was a freelance writer, they'd be, oh, who do you write for? And I'd be like, anybody who pays. But
yeah, that's it.
That actually goes, so you were a published travel writer, again, predating 2003, predating Cheapest Destinations blog. You were already writing. This makes you like, if you were an OG travel blogger, you're also, one of the, well, maybe not an OG travel writer, but you've been at it for a lot longer than a lot of people who are aspiring to this now.
Yeah, I'm not a young man. I've been at this a while.
Well, it said, your bio says 25 years, so I'm working with that. So you had to be at least 15.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I'm regularly approached by people who fancy being travel writers. Your book, Travel Writing 2.0, was very refreshing for me to read because you do not mince your words. You're pretty clear about what it takes to make it in the business and about what a lot of the fallacies are, what the misinterpretations are. I'm regularly approached by people who go, oh, I want to start a travel blog and I'm going to travel the world and my blog is going to pay for my travels. And, I'll be like, oh, so when are you leaving? They're like, I'm leaving in 3 months. Yeah. Which of course is, spoiler alert, that's a recipe for disaster. But what would you say to someone who does aspire to become a travel writer and or travel blogger and to have that be a part of a lifestyle of traveling the world?
Yeah, that timing thing is really important because I tell everybody it's going to take at least a year before you start making any kind of money, much less enough money to live on. And that's if you do everything perfectly right. I mean, it doesn't matter that you have the greatest articles in the world and you're able to write about something nobody else has written about. It's still going to take you that long just to get indexed properly in Google and to start building an audience and build up social followers, real followers that you didn't go pay for. It just takes time. And that's also true if you're starting an e-commerce business or a SaaS business, software as a service or anything, or even if you're opening a restaurant, it's going to take a year and 2 years, 3 years. And I think 3 years is how long it takes people before they can replace their old income. Like if they had a regular job, I think people have to build that into their plans. I mean, if you're backpacking around the world, you might in a year or year and a half start making enough to live on. If you're traveling really frugally and staying in cheap guest houses and hostels, you could actually reach a point where you're paying for your expenses with a blog, but not in that first year if you're just taking off, So people have to have a reasonable expectation. One way to supplement that is to do some freelance articles. And, we have both done a good bit of that. And that can be faster payment for what you do. So that can supplement it a bit. But that's not easy either. It's a lot of pitching, basically, sending queries to editors and hoping that someone will take that. And the less experience you have, the harder that is, too. So I think it's like a lot of jobs that look fun. People see the glamorous side and they see what looks to be exciting and they say, oh, I want to do that. And they haven't seen everything that came before that.
And I think that probably applies to a lot of careers, but I guess any career where we're exposed to the public, where we are the front-facing face of whatever it is, I regularly, people think, oh, when the pandemic hit and I wasn't traveling, people are like, oh, you mustn't be working at all. I mean, you see, how hard can it be to write a travel article once in a while and put it up on your site? It's like, ooh, there's a lot more to it than that. But that I think applies to a lot of businesses. What the end product is really just, that's a reflection of just an iceberg of work that goes into it.
And kids, don't believe what you see on Instagram.
Yeah. Oh my God. Don't even get me started.
A lot of those people are really broke.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the people who say they're making a lot of money, they may or may not be, And that's it too, because we were talking the other day, you mentioned that there are a lot of travel influencers out there who aren't actually making money. They're making trips.
Yes, they're getting their travel expenses covered, but that's as far as it goes.
Yeah.
And you can't pay your rent with that, or even buy your own plane tickets.
Absolutely. And that's an interesting element of I think the travel writing business, or writing in general. Like there are some large publications out there that do not pay their writers. And I've always taken issue, and there's a lot of people who flock to these publications for the exposure. But the problem is, by not paying writers, in my opinion, you undervalue the entire industry. And you make it more difficult for any writer anywhere to get a fair wage.
You're also not going to get the same level of articles because the professionals are going to avoid the site.
Well, that's true too. I just won't write for a site that is not paying. So that's definitely another angle to it. Well, I'm sure we could go on forever, but I'm going to be respectful of your time, and we've got some tacos to eat. So where can people find you?
Well, the easiest site is just my name, timleffel.com, because that links out to everything else. But it's the cheapestdestinationsblog.com. Just cheapestdestinationsblog.com, perceptivetravel.com, and then all of my books are on Amazon, and they're pretty easy to find elsewhere as well.
And what social media channel is your channel of choice?
Well, I'm probably on Twitter the most, and that's just my name, Tim Leffel, but I'm on all the others too, for the most part. No TikTok, too old for that. My daughter's on it.
I haven't made the leap to TikTok yet either.
But there aren't many people with my name, thankfully, in the Google age, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Excellent. Well, Tim, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and the hordes of people who shall be watching and listening to this interview today.
Thanks for coming to my house to do this.
Hey, listen, and your hospitality has been fabulous, and it has been a real pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks so much.
If you're interested in taking your gig on the road and going abroad, whether to live or just to work or travel, I have a checklist of 10 things to do before you travel long term. And a lot of these things are going to be logistical stuff that you may or may not have thought of that will help you set your life, your affairs, and your work up so you can travel effectively and stress-free. So click the link on the description or show notes to get your free checklist. And in the meantime, I'm Nora Dunn. I'm otherwise known as the Professional Hobo, and I will catch you next time.